Okay, so lastly, we're going to do Chile, which just we're going to kind of do a case study and go through Chile's experience in the Cold War because it's kind of like emblematic of everything that we talked about, or we can see how all these things played out. So first, we could start with land reform. So Chile starts with a high degree of wealth inequality, unequal land distribution. There's some land reform in the 60s with state and church land dispersed. But then when Allende gets elected in 1970, he does massive land reform. Then we have the coup. But you should probably I should mention this. You should listen to the podcast on Chile before this part of the lecture. So there's two podcasts this week on the history of Chile, on the Chicago Boys. You should listen to that before this part of the lecture. That'll kind of give you a good background. So I'm going to assume you have listened to that. So under Pinochet, 30% of this is returned. And so here you have that tension of land reform. So you have land reform in Asia. The U.S. can kind of be the bad guy in a lot of those places. And so you don't have kind of this internal struggle between the landowners. So the landowners, of course, they're angry about this redistribution here, and they're essentially able to regain power, or they're allied with Pinochet, and gain some of their land back. So some of that internal political struggle during the Allende years comes from this redistribution, where essentially there's nobody else to blame for it, and so Allende gets blamed. Or I mean, he did it, but I mean, like, there's no one else to shift as to this becomes an internal battle instead of blaming the U.S. or something for the reallocation. Okay, so you have, and again, you have this high degree of wealth inequality, which can be an issue, and sort of we have this being returned under Pinochet. You have the CIA. You have the CIA operating against Allende and others who would be pro-Soviet. So in '64, the CIA has propaganda and funding backs Frey for the election. He's elected. Allende is elected in 1970. He is hostile to the U.S. So the CIA spends money to defeat him. Now, it should be noted that the KGB is also spending money to get him elected. And that KGB money is actually much more effective. So they actually are funding Allende directly, essentially paying him. They are bribing some of his opponents to not run against him. So he kind of has that part of the political spectrum under wraps. And then after he is elected, there is direct aid from the Soviet Union to Chile. So there's just direct money going to their economy. In '73, we have a CIA-backed coup. So Pinochet takes power. The CIA had also, so while the Soviets are funding Allende, the CIA are funding Allende's opponents from 70 to 73. And then post 73, the KGB, after Pinochet takes power, the KGB kind of shifts to what's called active measures against Pinochet, where essentially he's a brutal dictator. But the KGB shifts to publicizing that fact. And they're pretty successful in, getting the world to know about how bad Pinochet was. So this is just, I don't have the date here. In 1976, there's 66 articles in the New York Times on Pinochet versus 4 on Pol Pot. So they're essentially successful at publicizing what Pinochet is doing. Okay. And there's also some forgery stuff. There's evidence that they were forging links between the CIA and Pinochet's secret police. They're like forging letters between them, although that's a bit speculative. Okay. And then in 1988, Pinochet steps down. So, here you have a democratically elected person who's sympathetic to the Soviet Union, kind of displaced, but the CIA helps displace. Again, it's unclear how much the CIA mattered, as the KGB was directly helping Allende, but whatever, he is displaced. The CIA is involved, and a brutal dictator comes to power. An undemocratic person comes to power. Okay, and you can kind of see it actually in that the U.S. influence goes to zero here, and you can even see it in their exports. The exports from the U.S. to Chile dramatically fall. Okay, and so Pinochet is kind of economic agnostic. He doesn't really know anything about the economy. He doesn't care about the economy. But as is covered in the podcast, you have these Chicago boys who are educated at the University of Chicago, And essentially, they implement many of the Washington Consensus suggestions. Okay, fiscal prudence, non-inflationary monetary policy, privatization of state-owned industries, although they do not privatize the copper, all of the copper, foreign direct investment, and trade liberalization. So they broadly implement many of the Washington Consensus policies. Okay. And so you can see the jump in the economic freedom here. So essentially, this is like the initial wave of reforms, and then there are reforms throughout the 80s into the 90s, liberalizing the economy. Okay. And, largely, it's difficult because most of the growth happens post Pinochet, if this is the big reforms here, but you have continued reforms here. So, depends on, I guess, whatever your ideology is, or not. I don't know if that, I don't want to be that strong, but it's like, it's hard to untangle what exactly led to the Chilean economic success, but it does seem that these reforms were, I don't know, broadly successful. I hesitate to say that because I know a lot of people would not take offense to that, but disagree with that. But essentially, their economy, they liberalized their economy here, throughout, basically from Pinochet up to there. And again, this is not to defend Pinochet in any way. Pinochet is obviously a brutal dictator who many people were murdered under his watch, and so no amount of economic growth could justify that. Hopefully, that goes without saying. But this is just to analyze what is happening with the economy. So you have the CIA-backed coup. Again, we see that when we see some of the Washington Consensus policies are implemented, and growth does follow. Here's the Chilean growth experience. So you have this recession actually here, with actually bank bailouts. And then you have growth basically from this point on. In terms of post-Pinochet, here you have essentially the Chilean growth experience is better than any of their neighbors and the US. Here's another way to look at it. Here you can see them starting below in 1990. They start below, they end up above essentially all their neighbors. Okay. There is a lot of critique about a rise in inequality, where there's actually a fall, but there's actually a fall in inequality. So Chile starts out very unequal and is still unequal by global standards, but it has fallen since 90. And life expectancy has also gone up. So this is a country that essentially, we see it as a Cold War battleground. We see the CIA, the KGB operating, essentially the U.S. and the Soviet Union attempting to, assert their influence. The U.S. essentially wins, although it's at sacrificing their ideals. They support a brutal dictator. That dictator does implement many of the U.S. foreign policy or the economic policy prescriptions of the time, and the country does grow. However, it does grow, and it becomes more equal. So it grows, becomes more equal, and life expectancy goes up. And yet, those scars are still with the country. So this country still has a high degree of unrest. And I believe they're rewriting their constitution. I don't know if that's happened yet. Sorry, I'm not quite up on the Chilean news, but there's, at least as of last year, there's widespread protests, and a lot of those scars, as you can listen to in that podcast, were or a lot of those issues were never addressed from the Pinochet days. And having lived there, it's very much. I lived there in 2001, and it's very akin to the present in the U.S., where it was a very polarized country then, just as the U.S. is very polarized now. So polarized that it was just something that you knew not to talk about. You did not ask people about Pinochet to figure out if they were pro-Pinochet or anti-Pinochet. You just didn't bring it up because it would be so contentious. Kind of like if you're meeting somebody now, that maybe if you're meeting someone at church or something like that, or that is not from your social circle, you probably don't want to bring up politics. Although, of course, I mean, I don't know. In the pandemic, it's like I haven't met anybody in like I don't know how many months. And so I don't know. It's just a nice case study. And again, maybe I'm biased because I live there, but I think it's a nice case study where we can see kind of all these aspects of U.S. intervention, U.S. sacrificing their ideals, U.S. economic policy, all kind of playing out in this one place. Okay. All right, that is it for the mammoth Cold War lecture. Actually, I have a works cited this time if you are interested, because I assume people might be interested in this. So this is all the sources, the primary sources for this lecture. All right. And of course, there's the Chicago Boys. I should actually, the NPR Chicago Boys is a source for this, and also there's a documentary on Vimeo about the Chicago Boys as well. That is kind of a source for this. All right, wow, long lecture, as you can tell. I literally started this morning, and I don't know if you can tell by the background. I'm ending this tonight at 8 p.m. Not that I was recording it all day. I've been in and out. I've been doing stuff with my kid. I haven't been abandoning my child. I've been in and out all day. All right. So long lecture, but you technically have 2 weeks to do it, or 2 weeks to have gotten through this. All right. I will stop talking. So I'm sure you're tired.